I used to believe that love was the one thing the Imperium couldn't take from you, that even when they stripped away your name, your home, your hope, somewhere in the quiet between bombardments, love could survive. I was wrong. In this galaxy, even love is a weapon. My name doesn't matter anymore. It's been erased by duty, by years of service, by the slow machinery of obedience. But before I was a soldier, before the ash and the orders, I was a husband, a father, just another man trying to keep his family alive on a world that forgot what peace felt like. You don't plan to have a family in the Imperium. It happens in the cracks of desperation, a brief flicker of warmth in a universe built from cold. Maybe it's the illusion of normalcy, or maybe it's defiance. But for a moment, you convince yourself that life is more than service and death. You hold someone, you whisper promises, and for a while, you believe them. Our hive was called Mercantor Spire 12, one of the lower hab blocks where the air tastes like rust, and the sky is just a rumor passed down from the lucky ones who work maintenance on the upper levels. My wife, Mara, worked in a manufactorum line. She assembled lasgun casings, 12 hours a shift, under the eyes of a servitor that never blinked. Her hands were always bandaged. The metal dust eats through skin after a few years. I used to tell her she should ask for reassignment. She used to laugh and go where, she'd say. Up, down, it's all the same direction here. When our son was born, the lights in the hab block flickered for 2 days. The medici said it was nothing, just the strain on the power grid. But I liked to think it was something more, as if the hive itself was trying to notice that, for once, something new had entered it. We named him Leo. The name means nothing. It just sounded like hope. People say that children are blessings. In the Imperium, they're liabilities, another mouth to feed, another name for the tithe lists, another potential heretic if they grow up asking the wrong questions. But for me, he was a reason to keep breathing, to endure the shifts, the hunger, the silence. Every time I came home and saw him sleeping under the flickering lumen light, I felt, just for a heartbeat, that maybe we weren't already dead. That illusion doesn't last. Nothing pure does here. The administratum came one morning with a new census, a draft expansion. They said it was for the defense of the sector, that heretics were moving through the outer rim, but in the hive, rumors spread faster than scripture. They weren't after soldiers, they were after numbers, and numbers never come back. When they came to our block, Mara hid Leo in a maintenance shaft. He didn't understand why he had to be quiet. He kept asking if we were playing a game, the kind where you hide and the monsters go away. The soldiers didn't knock, they never do. They just enter, helmets, masks, eyes like glass. One of them scanned our ident chips and frowned. Population discrepancy, he said. His voice was flat like it belonged to someone else. Mara smiled. I'll never forget that smile, the kind you give a child before the end of a story. She said, "We have no children." For a second I thought it worked. Then one of the troopers lifted her arm and pressed a brand against her forearm, the mark of deceit. They didn't shoot her. That would have been mercy. They logged the infraction, logged my name beside hers, and moved on. No emotion, no pause, just another line in a report that would be processed, lost, and forgotten. That night the hive lights dimmed again. Only this time it wasn't from power strain. The manufactorum had exploded, a pressurization fault, they said, hundreds dead, no survivors, no inquiries. I never saw Mara again. Beat of silence, microhook, guilt and decay. After that the hive changed, or maybe I did. Every corridor, every mechanical hum sounded different, colder. The sermons grew louder, the posters multiplied. The words "family is faith, faith is duty," painted over the burn marks from the explosion. I started believing that maybe the Emperor didn't want families. Maybe he needed us alone, easier to break that way. But Leo, he kept me human, or tried to. He'd draw pictures on scraps of paper, crude sketches of a son he'd never seen. Sometimes he'd ask when we could go there. I told him, someday. I don't think he believed me. I don't think I did either. Time in the hive doesn't move forward, it just sinks. Weeks dissolve into years. You wake up, work, eat, sleep, pray, and pretend you're not dying. Until one day, someone notices you again. That day came when a priest visited our block. He wasn't like the others. His robes were torn and his eyes looked kind. That's dangerous here. Kindness is heresy in disguise. He saw Leo drawing and said, "He has a gift." I told him we couldn't afford gifts. He just smiled and said, "The Emperor provides." 2 days later, the Ecclesiar. Chai summoned us. They said Leo had been chosen for service, the Schola Progenium. A blessing, they called it, an honor. I knew what it was, the orphan factory. the place where they turn children into weapons, priests, or corpses. I wanted to refuse, but there's no word for no in High Gothic when the order comes from the church. You just bow your head and say, Ave Imperator. That night I didn't sleep. I watched him breathe. I memorized the way his chest rose and fell, every small motion, every sound. I tried to imagine what the Emperor wanted with him. Maybe he needed another soul to feed the machine, or maybe he just couldn't stand the sight of love lasting this long. When the priests came the next morning, I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I just handed them my son. And in that moment, I realized something. The Imperium doesn't need to kill you to take everything. It just waits until you love something, and then it finds a way to make you give it up yourself. In this galaxy, love isn't forbidden, it's weaponized. After they took him, the hab felt different. The walls seemed thinner, as if the metal itself remembered his voice. The silence wasn't quiet anymore, it was alive, pressing down like a living thing. I tried to go back to work, tried to pray, tried to believe that the Emperor was watching over him, but every prayer felt like a lie whispered to a deaf god. Days became rotations. The manufactorum still burned through men like promethium. The sermons still blared through the vox gasters. The world went on, indifferent to the fact that my son had been consumed by it. But in the corners, in the whispers of the workers, I started to hear something. Stories, rumors about others like me, parents who had lost their children to the same machine. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in my grief. The Imperium doesn't destroy families in one way, it finds thousands. There was a man who lived 2 floors down from me. They said his wife had been taken by the Adeptus Mechanicus, not as a soldier or a servitor, but as a cogitator assistant. She was brilliant, apparently, gifted with numbers. One day she just stopped coming home. A few months later he received a message. Her consciousness had been transferred into a machine for greater efficiency. They told him it was an honor. He tried to speak to her once through the Vox terminal. They said she didn't remember him. And then there was the merchant's daughter, a girl from the upper spires. Her family had power, wealth, and the favor of the administratum. She was promised to a noble, a union meant to bind 2 trade houses together. But when the wedding day came, the groom's ship never arrived. The rumor was that he'd been requisitioned by the Imperial Navy mid-transit, drafted to die in some war that didn't even have a name. The marriage contract was voided. Her family fell into debt. She hung herself beneath the banners of the Emperor. They called it a devotional act. That's how the Imperium buries love, with ceremony. They sanctify it, bless it, and then erase it beneath the language of faith and duty. But the pain remains, buried beneath prayers and incense smoke. I started to wander the hive after shifts ended, walking through corridors that smelled like burnt oil and decay. Sometimes I'd see families in the feeding halls, mothers spooning nutrient paste into the mouths of their children, trying to pretend it was food. The fathers staring blankly at the flickering hollow screens, waiting for their next shift assignment. Every face carried the same expression, exhaustion mixed with defiance. The quiet, stubborn kind that refuses to die even when hope already has. One night I passed a chapel. The doors were open, and inside I saw hundreds kneeling before a gilded statue of the Emperor. Gold paint flaked from his armor. Candles burned low, casting shadows that made his face look human, tired, sorrowful. I stood there for a long time, watching the people pray. For their sons, their daughters, their lovers lost to war or work or the endless machine of survival. The priest's voice echoed through the chamber. To love is to serve is to suffer. To suffer is to be close to him. I wondered if the Emperor ever had a family, if he remembered what it felt like to hold someone and not be worshipped by them, if he ever knew what it was to lose a child and still keep believing. After that night, I started to keep a journal, not for the administratum or for confession, but for myself. Small things, memories before they faded, the sound of Mara's laugh, the smell of coolant and cheap bread, the way Leo's hand fit inside mine. I wrote them down because memory was all I had left, and in the Imperium, memory is rebellion. They can control your work, your speech, your faith, but not what you remember, not yet. Sometimes I thought about leaving. There were rumors of smugglers who could get you off-world. They said there were agri-planets, places where you could still see the sun, where families lived without the roar of machinery, but I knew the truth. There's no escape. The Imperium stretches across the stars like a cage with a million locks. Every world is another prison, painted with a different sky. Still, the thought lingered. The idea of a world where my son could grow up and know what grass feels like. It was a fantasy, but it was mine. And in the Imperium, fantasies are dangerous. A few weeks later, I was summoned to report to the Munitorum. They said they needed more workers for the war effort. Temporary reassignment, they called it. Everyone knew what that meant, conscription by another name. I was given a choice, serve in logistics or the guard. Logistics meant dying slowly. The guard meant dying quickly. I chose the guard. They gave me a rifle, an ident code, and a prayer sheet. They didn't ask if I had anyone left. Maybe they already knew. Maybe that's why they chose me. A man with no family fights harder. He has nothing left to lose. When I boarded the transport, the air reeked of oil and sweat. Men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, eyes hollow, lips moving silently in prayer. Across from me sat a young woman holding a child. I stared at her for a long time. The way she clutched the baby close, the way her hands trembled every time the ship lurched. I wanted to tell her to hide, to run, to never let them take him. But I didn't, because I knew there was nowhere to go. When the engines ignited, she began to cry. Not loud, just a quiet, shaking sob that filled the space between us. The soldier beside her turned his head and whispered, "Quiet your spawn, woman." She didn't respond. I wanted to speak, to defend her, but my voice caught. I remembered Mara's smile, Leo's small fingers clutching mine. And I realized that this moment, this cruelty, was all the Imperium had ever taught us. The ship lifted, rumbling through the void, carrying us toward a front we'd never see the end of. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words came out wrong. "Protect them," I whispered. I didn't know who I meant anymore. That's the thing about families in the Imperium. You never really lose them all at once. The machine takes them piece by piece. Your wife to fire, your son to faith, your heart to fear, and leaves you with just enough to keep moving, enough to keep serving, enough to hurt. They say the Emperor watches over all his children. But in the dark between stars, surrounded by the broken and the damned, I can't help but wonder if he ever truly sees us, or if we are just the echoes of a prayer he stopped saying a long time ago. War doesn't start with the first gunshot. It starts long before that, with silence, with the sound of engines groaning to life, of men pretending not to think about what's coming. The transport carried us for weeks, maybe months. Time stopped meaning anything once the stars began to blur into streaks of light. Each day was the same, the stench of fear, the sermons blaring through tin speakers, the endless scraping of boots on metal. They told us we were bound for the frontier, where heretics had overrun a mining world. They said we'd be saving millions of lives, but everyone knew the truth. The Imperium doesn't save lives, it spends them. There were others on the ship, soldiers, priests, scribes, and conscripts like me. Some still talked about the families they left behind. They'd whisper to each other when the lights dimmed, trading memories like currency. One man spoke about his daughter who worked in the agri-fields of a frontier moon. He hadn't seen her in years. He carried a scrap of cloth from her tunic in his pocket, rubbing it between his fingers like a relic. Another woman kept a locket with 2 names etched inside. Her husband had died in the Astra Militarum. Her son was training to join the same regiment. When I asked why she let him, she said, "Because it's better to die fighting than to die forgotten." I began to realize that in the Imperium, family isn't about blood, it's about endurance. The people you endure for, the ones whose names you whisper when the shells fall and the sky burns. Even if they're already gone, the memory keeps you human. When we reached the planet's surface, it wasn't what they promised. No heroism, no banners, no glory, just mud, smoke, and corpses. The heretics were gone, the war already over. We were the cleanup crew, sent to bury the dead and burn the rest. Rows of pyres lined the horizon, and the air tasted like iron and ash. Our camp was a graveyard of machines. Lemon rust tanks rusting in the rain, servitors dragging bodies into piles. At night, we'd huddle around dim fires, pretending not to hear the screams from the med tents. It was there that I met someone who changed everything. Her name was Sira. She wasn't a soldier. She was one of the medici staff, pulled from the lower decks when too many of the real ones died. Her hands were small, her eyes sharp and lynching. She moved like someone who'd seen too much but refused to break. The first time she spoke to me, she asked if I still had family. I told her no. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She just nodded, as if that was the most ordinary truth in the galaxy. For weeks we barely talked. The front didn't allow for softness. But sometimes, when the fires burned low and the sky turned red from the pyres, we'd share stories. She told me about her sister who had been taken by the black ships when they were children. She didn't even get to say goodbye. Maybe she serves the Emperor now, she said. Maybe she burns brighter than all of us. I told her about Leo, about Mara, about how love here felt like a curse that kept finding new ways to punish me. She listened quietly, then said, maybe that's what makes it real. Love in the Imperium isn't gentle. It's survival disguised as affection. It's two people holding each other just to remember what warmth feels like. It's the desperate need to feel alive before the next bombardment erases everything. But for a time, Sira and I found a kind of peace. When the fighting moved closer, the officers ordered an evacuation. The enemy had regrouped somewhere in the mountains, and we were to reinforce the front. The day before we left, I saw Sira standing at the edge of the camp, looking at the fires. "Do you ever wonder if anyone will remember us?" she asked. I didn't answer. I think she already knew. The convoy left at dawn. She stayed behind with the wounded. I promised I'd come back. I even believed it for a while. But the Emperor doesn't deal in promises, only debts. Our transport crashed halfway through the valley. Artillery fire tore through the line, and everything became light and thunder. When I woke, I was surrounded by silence again, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that devours. I crawled out from the wreckage and saw bodies scattered across the plain. The banner of the Imperium lay torn, fluttering in the mud. For 3 days I wandered among the ruins, half dead, half dreaming. I saw families burned together, still clutching each other in death. I saw a man trying to dig a grave for his wife with his bare hands. I saw children carrying lasguns too heavy for their arms, eyes empty of anything human. This was what family meant now. Not warmth, not home, just shared suffering. When I finally found another Imperial unit, they didn't ask who I was or where I came from. They just handed me a shovel and told me to dig. So I dug, graves upon graves. The soil turned black with blood and oil. Every name I whispered into the dirt felt like my own. Sometimes at night I'd see faces in the flames. Mara, Leo, Sira. I'd tell myself they were alive somewhere, that maybe they'd made it off-world, that maybe the Emperor had spared them. But I knew better. The Imperium doesn't spare anyone, it just forgets slower. I started to write again, small notes on scraps of parchment, not prayers, letters, to the ones I'd lost. I told them what I saw, what I became, I don't know why. Maybe because I needed them to know that even here, even in this pit of ash and madness, I still remembered them. That in a universe where nothing survives, memory is the only rebellion left. We lost the valley weeks later. The enemy swept through like a tide. They called it a strategic withdrawal. I called it what it was, another grave waiting to be filled. As we retreated, I found myself thinking of all the families scattered across the Imperium. The ones clinging to each other on hive worlds, on agri fields, in void ships and manufactorums. Each one fighting to keep something sacred alive in a universe built to erase it. Maybe that's the closest thing to faith there is, not in the Emperor, but in the quiet persistence of love. Because even now, after everything I've lost, I can't stop believing that somewhere, on some forgotten world, a mother is still holding her child, a father is still whispering stories in the dark, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough to keep the stars burning. After the retreat, they sent us to a world called Enoch's Reach. The name sounded almost holy, like it might offer redemption. It didn't. It was just another rock, one more piece of the Emperor's endless graveyard. But for the first time in years, there was no screaming, no bombardment, no constant thunder of artillery, just wind, cold, endless wind that carried the smell of dust and iron. We built a camp in the ruins of an old monastery. The stone walls still bore the scars of past wars, bolter shells lodged in the marble like embedded memories. Someone said the Emperor had walked here once before he was a god. I don't know if that's true, but I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe he might still look upon this place and remember what it was like to be human. The weeks that followed were strange, quiet, too quiet. Soldiers began to talk again, they laughed, even smiled. Someone brewed amasic from machine oil and fur. Mented rations. It tasted like death, but for a few hours each night it made us forget. The fires burned brighter. The stars looked almost kind. I found myself drawn to one of the ruins near the edge of the camp, an old chapel, its stained glass windows shattered but still shimmering with color when the sun hit just right. I would sit there when the day ended, writing in my journal, letters to no one, to Leo, to Mara, to Sira, to ghosts. One night as I sat there, someone joined me, a young soldier named Kale. He couldn't have been older than 19. His armor still shone unscarred. He asked what I was writing. I told him memories. He nodded, then said, I write too, letters to my mother, not that she'll ever get them. I asked why he kept writing. He smiled, that naive, impossible kind of smile that still believed in something. Because it makes her real, he said. In that moment I saw what the Imperium fears most. Not heresy, not rebellion, memory. Memory keeps us human, and humanity is the one thing their machines can't control. Days passed, the wind grew colder. Rumors spread that the war was turning in our favor, though no one ever said which war. There are always too many to count, but the peace didn't last, it never does. One morning the sky turned black, not from clouds but from smoke, columns rising in the distance where the next settlement should have been. The Vox channels crackled with static and panic. The heretics had returned, they said, a full offensive. The officers shouted orders, priests screamed prayers, and before we could even pack the tents, the bombardment began. I remember the first shell hitting the camp. The ground tore apart like it was alive. Fire and metal rained from the heavens. The old monastery crumbled, statues of saints collapsing into dust. Men screamed, some prayed, some ran. I did neither. I just stood there, watching the sky burn. Cale found me in the chaos. His face was streaked with soot, his hands shaking. We have to go, he shouted. I nodded, but I wasn't looking at him. I was staring at the chapel, at the place where I'd written all my letters. It was on fire. The pages, the names, the memories, all of it burning. For a moment I wanted to run into the flames, to pull them out, to save even one word, but I didn't move, because I knew it wouldn't matter. The Imperium burns everything eventually. We ran for hours, through mud, through corpses, through the ruins of what used to be faith. The bombardment followed us like a storm that wouldn't end. When it finally stopped, there were maybe a dozen of us left. We found shelter in a cave near the edge of the valley. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. That night none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the darkness, listening to the distant thunder of war. Cale sat beside me, clutching a small data slate to his chest. My letters, he said, they're all I have left. I wanted to tell him to keep them safe, but I didn't, because I knew one day he'd lose them too. The next morning the bombardment started again. They found us. They always find us. The cave collapsed under the impact. I remember the light, blinding, searing, endless, then nothing. When I woke, everything was quiet again. Dust hung in the air like fog. The entrance was gone. The others were gone. My leg was crushed beneath the rubble. I could barely breathe. I tried to call out, but my voice was drowned by the sound of the wind howling through cracks in the stone. For a while I thought about praying, but what would I even say? I've prayed before, for mercy, for forgiveness, for meaning. The Emperor answered once with silence, and maybe that's all there ever was. As the hours passed, I began to drift, between sleep and memory. I saw Mara's face again, Leo's laugh, Sira's hands, Cale's smile. They appeared like ghosts, standing in the dim light filtering through the cracks. I reached for them, but my hands found only dust. And then, for the first time in years, I cried. Not for them, for myself, for what I'd become, a hollow vessel of obedience. A man who once had a family and traded it for survival. A man who thought love could endure even here, and was proven wrong. But even as I lay there dying, I realized something. The Imperium can break your body, your mind, your faith, but it can't make you forget, not truly. Even when everything else is gone, love remains like a scar, buried deep, aching, immortal. When the rescue teams found me days later, they said I was lucky. I laughed when they said it. Luck in the Imperium is just another word for delay. They patched me up, stamped my file, and sent me to a new assignment. Another world, another war, another beginning that would only ever end the same way. But as I boarded the next ship, limping through the endless corridors of steel and light, I carried something with me. Not the journal, that was gone. Not faith, that had burned long ago, but a memory. Why of a child's hand in mine, of a woman's voice calling me home, of a brief, impossible peace in a universe that only knows how to devour. That's what it's like to have a family in the Imperium. It's to love something fragile in a world built to destroy it. It's to fight for warmth in the cold heart of eternity, knowing it will always slip away, and to do it anyway. They sent me to another front after Enoch's Reach. I don't remember the name. Maybe I never knew it. It doesn't matter. All worlds look the same after enough war, gray skies, black soil, and red rivers that never run clear. But something inside me had changed. The man who arrived here wasn't the one who left the hive. He was a shadow wearing my skin, walking through the motions of faith and duty like an echo that refused to die. The regiment I joined was called the 72nd Vardian Infantry, a name without faces. Men and women pulled from a dozen worlds, bound together by orders, not loyalty. We were ghosts pretending to be soldiers. The commissars told us we were defending the Imperium from corruption, that every heretic we burned brought humanity one step closer to salvation. But after a while, all the heretics began to look the same. Desperate, starving, human. One night during a raid, we captured a small settlement. The locals had been sheltering deserters, or so the reports said. When we arrived, there was no resistance, just silence and the smell of burnt grain. The captain ordered us to search every home. Inside one of them, I found a woman and a child. She couldn't have been older than Mara when I last saw her. The boy was maybe 6. He looked at me with those wide, uncomprehending eyes that didn't know fear yet, only confusion. The captain told me to separate them, the boy for re-education, the mother for questioning. I hesitated. For a second I saw Leo in that child's face. I saw Mara and the woman S. My hands trembled. The captain noticed. He shouted my name, told me to obey, and I did, because that's what we do in the Imperium, we obey. We cut out the part of ourselves that hesitates, that remembers, that still feels. I tore them apart while she screamed, and I told myself it was mercy. That at least one of them might survive. Later, when the camp fell silent, I found the boys drawing in the dirt. A stick figure holding hands with another under a crude sun. I don't know why, but I took it, folded it, kept it in my pocket. Maybe I wanted to be punished. Maybe I already was. That night I dreamed of Leo again. He wasn't a child anymore. He was wearing the robes of the Schola Progenium, eyes blank, lips moving in silent prayer. When he looked at me, I saw nothing, not recognition, not anger, not love, just the hollow calm of someone who had been emptied and filled with something else. When I woke, I realized that the dream wasn't punishment, it was prophecy. They tell us the Emperor loves all his children, but love in the Imperium is just another word for ownership. He doesn't love us, he uses us, burns us, forges us into something useful until there's nothing left but faith and bone, and when we break, they call it sacrifice. I stopped praying after that. I stopped pretending. The chaplains noticed, of course. You can't hide disbelief for long. One day they summoned me. I was brought before a preacher, one of those with eyes like melted gold and a voice that could make entire battalions weep. He asked if I had faith. I told him I wasn't sure anymore. He smiled, slow and gentle, like a father speaking to a wayward son. Doubt, he said, is the first sign of corruption, but it can be cured. They called it purification. I called it torture. Days of confinement, sermons played through vox amplifiers until they drilled through your skull. No sleep, no food, just the endless voice of the Emperor's mercy. They said it was to remind us of our purpose, to cleanse us of weakness. But all I could think about was how quiet the world had been when I still had a family. When they finally released me, I wasn't cleansed. I was empty. The kind of empty that hums, the kind that makes silence sound like screaming. They sent me back to the front, said I'd been redeemed. I don't remember the battles that followed, just flashes, fire, blood, faces I'll never know. But something strange happened after that. Amid the madness, I began to see families everywhere. A soldier carrying the body of his brother through the mud, a medic whispering a prayer over a dying comrade. Even the servitors, their eyes long gone, seemed to reach for each other as they powered down. It was like the galaxy itself was trying to remember what it once meant to care. One night, as I sat beside a ruined transport, an old sergeant came to me. His armor was cracked, his face scarred beyond recognition. He sat down without a word and handed me a ration tin. "You've got the look," he said, "the one that comes after loss." I didn't respond. He stared into the fire for a long time before saying, "The Emperor doesn't love us. Not the way we think. He needs us. And maybe that's worse. But if you find someone who still remembers your name, that's something even he can't take." It was the first true thing anyone had said to me in years. I kept thinking about that, about names, about how easily the Imperium replaces them with numbers, ranks, titles. Husband becomes laborer, father becomes guardsman, love becomes loyalty. They erase everything that makes us human and call it righteousness. But what if faith isn't obedience? What if faith is the act of remembering who we were before they told us to forget? That thought scared me more than any enemy ever could, because once you start remembering, you stop belonging, you stop fitting into the machine, and the Imperium doesn't forgive that. I carried that thought with me for months, through every bombardment, every retreat, every meaningless victory. It became a kind of prayer, not to the Emperor, but to what was left of me, to the part that still ached when I thought of Leo's hand in mine or Mara's laugh echoing in the corridors of the hive. I started whispering their names before every battle like a charm, not asking for salvation, just memory. Because in this endless night, memory is the only light that burns. It happened during a siege on a nameless moon, one of the kind that barely existed on any map, a scarred rock orbiting a dying star. We'd been entrenched there for weeks, surrounded on all sides. Supplies were gone, communication lost. The commissars had stopped giving orders. That's how you know you've been abandoned, when the shouting stops. The air was thick with smoke and desperation. Men talked less, prayed more. Some carved the aquila into their flesh, hoping pain would draw the Emperor's eye. Others just stared into the distance, waiting for the end to come. I didn't pray, I didn't hope. I just kept fighting, not for victory, but for the simple act of not dying yet. Survival had become my only language. On the 5th week, a supply drop finally came, or at least that's what we thought. The sky filled with lights, flares descending like stars, but instead of food or ammunition, the pods were full of reinforcements. Children, the Schola Progenium had sent us replacements, fresh bodies, faces still soft, eyes still bright. I remember one boy stepping out of the pod, clutching a lasgun too big for him. He looked no older than Leo would have been. The sergeant barked at them to form ranks. I watched them line up, pale, trembling, obedient. They recited their prayers in perfect rhythm, their voices hollow but steady. It was then that I saw him, a face among the new recruits, familiar, sharp eyes, a small scar above his brow. My breath caught, my heart stopped. For a moment I thought it was impossible. But it was. Leo. Older, taller, but unmistakable. The curve of his jaw, the same restless focus I'd seen in him as a child. My son, or what was left of him. He didn't see me, didn't recognize me. The boy I once held in my arms now stood in the uniform of a soldier, eyes fixed forward, his soul already claimed by the machine. I wanted to speak, to call his name, to fall to my knees and tell him who I was, but I couldn't, because I realized something awful. If I told him, it would destroy him. The Schola doesn't make soldiers, it makes weapons. Weapons don't have fathers, they have targets, and in that moment I wasn't sure which one I'd be. That night I watched him from a distance as the fires burned. He sat among the other recruits, silent, listening to a priest read from the Catechism of Hate. His face was blank, serene. He moved like a statue come to life. I wanted to believe there was something human still inside him, buried beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. I wanted to believe he remembered me. The next morning, the enemy attacked. The sky cracked open under orbital bombardment, trenches collapsed. Vox lines screamed static. I found myself beside him, my own son, as the lines broke. He fought with a precision that was terrifying, every motion clean, every shot deliberate. There was no hesitation, no fear, just devotion. At one point, a shell hit near us. The blast threw me backward into the mud. When I looked up, I saw him, Leo, standing alone against a line of advancing heretics. His lasgun was empty, his armor cracked, blood streaming down his temple, but he didn't retreat. He just stood there, shouting a prayer I couldn't hear over the thunder, and then the light took him. I ran to him after the bombardment ended. The field was nothing but smoke and ruin, bodies twisted together like roots. I found him near the crater, still, his weapon half buried in the ash. His eyes were open, staring at the sky. For a long time I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just knelt beside him, pressing my forehead to his. The smell of blood and ozone filled the air. They say when a soldier dies, the Emperor receives his soul, but as I looked at my son's face, I realized that whatever soul he'd had, the Imperium had already taken it years ago. They'd killed him long before this battle. They'd just left the body for me to find. I buried him myself. The others told me to leave the dead for the carrion, but I couldn't. I dug into the mud with my hands until they bled, until I couldn't feel the difference between the dirt and my skin. I laid him down and placed his lasgun across his chest. For a headstone, I used the aquila from my own armor. I didn't pray. I just whispered his name, over and over until it didn't sound real anymore. After that, something in me broke, quietly, like glass under pressure. Not with a scream, but with silence. I didn't fight anymore, not really. I went through the motions, followed the orders, fired when told. But inside, I was gone. The war didn't end. It never does. It just changed shape. New orders, new planets, new faces. Always the same death, repeated endlessly across the stars. Sometimes I wonder if the Emperor understands what he's built. an empire of widows and orphans, a machine that feeds on its own children and calls it faith. Maybe he does, maybe that's the point. Maybe he wants us to love him the way we love our families, unconditionally, painfully, until it destroys us. Years have passed since that day, or maybe it's only been weeks. Time dissolves when every sunrise looks the same. I've been assigned to so many regiments I've stopped counting, but I still carry something with me. In the pocket of my armor, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, the boy's drawing, the one I found years ago, the stick figure under the sun. It's faded now, almost gone, but I keep it close. It's the last thing in this galaxy that still feels human. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see Leo standing in that field, sunlight breaking through the smoke, his face calm, his voice steady. I tell myself that maybe in that final moment he remembered me, that somewhere beneath the layers of training and indoctrination, the child who once drew suns and laughed in the dark still existed, just for an instant. And maybe that's enough. Because that's what love is in the Imperium, not salvation, not triumph, just endurance. The quiet refusal to forget, even when forgetting would be easier. They can take everything from you, your faith, your body, your name, but as long as you remember who you loved, you're still defying them. And maybe, just maybe, that's what it means to be human in this galaxy of gods and ghosts. There are worlds in the Imperium where the stars are never seen. Entire hives buried so deep that even the idea of the sky becomes myth. I've lived long enough now to know that most of us never escape those walls, not really. We just trade one set of steel and stone for another, ships instead of hives, trenches instead of homes. Yet after all the wars, all the endless marches across the galaxy's bones, I've begun to see something different, something I never expected to find again. It began on a transport ship bound for another forgotten front. The vessel was ancient, older than most of the worlds we fought for, its corridors narrow and flickering with lumen decay. The air hummed with the same smell I've come to associate with eternity, oil, metal, and human fatigue. We were hundreds packed into that flying tomb, all with the same expression, the hollow stare of those waiting for the next order, the next war, the next meaningless dawn. But there was one thing that made this voyage different. In the lower decks, tucked between supply crates and ammunition lockers, were families, actual families. Wives, children, elders, refugees from a world that had fallen to Xenos. They were being relocated, or so the officers claimed. I didn't believe it. The Imperium doesn't relocate people, it redistributes labor. Still, they were there, fragile, exhausted, alive. I remember the first night I saw them. A young mother sitting against the cold metal wall, holding a child no older than 3. The boy was sick, coughing in the recycled air. She tried to hush him with a lullaby, a melody so soft it almost sounded alien amid the noise of the engines. The tune was simple, but it pierced through everything. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. I forgot the endless war, the banners, the sermons. I was back in that hive, watching Mara hum the same rhythm to Leo when he couldn't sleep. When the mother noticed me staring, she smiled, not out of warmth, but as if to say, "Don't ruin this moment." So I didn't, I just listened. Over the following days, I found myself returning to that part of the ship. I told myself it was to help guard the refugees, to keep order, but that was a lie. I came because the sound of children laughing, even faintly, even through fear, reminded me of something I'd forgotten, the possibility of peace, the noise of life that exists despite everything trying to silence it. One day, mother approached me. She asked if I believed the Emperor watched over her child. I didn't know what to say. The truth felt cruel, so I told her he watches, but sometimes he looks through us to see if we'll watch for each other. She nodded, as if that was enough. Maybe it was. The boy grew weaker as the voyage went on. The medici had no real medicine, just pain suppressants and prayers. I gave him my water ration once, knowing it wouldn't help but needing to do something. The mother thanked me. Then one night she asked my name. I hesitated. For years I'd been a rank, a number, a function. My name had become a sound I barely remembered. But as I opened my mouth, it came back to me like a ghost whispering from another life. I told her. And for a moment, I felt human again. She began to tell me about her world, an agri-planet, green and open. Her husband had been taken by the guard years ago. "He'll come back," she said, but her voice cracked on the word back. I didn't correct her. I just listened, because I'd learned that sometimes the smallest kindness in the Imperium is silence. Then came the signal, an alarm tearing through the corridors. The ship jolted violently, a sudden impact that threw people to the ground. The Vox operator screamed something about an ambush, Xenos raiders, boarding action. the lights died, panic erupted like a storm. I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the sound of fighting. The air filled with gunfire and screams, the walls shook. I saw soldiers cut down in the dark, saw civilians trampled in the chaos. I reached the cargo hold just as the bulkhead was breached. A flash of light, a roar of pressure, bodies sucked into the void. When I turned, I saw her, the mother, clutching her child as the air screamed past us. I ran, not to fight, not to obey, just to reach her. I grabbed the edge of a pipe, my hand burning, and pulled them toward me. I don't know where the strength came from, maybe from something older than faith, maybe from guilt. The emergency shutters closed, sealing the breach, and for a moment the silence returned. I looked at her, eyes wide, chest heaving, clutching her son. He was still breathing, barely. The ship limped away from the battle, damaged but alive. The medici said the boy wouldn't last the night. There were no supplies left, no hope. The mother sat beside him, humming the same lullaby, her voice shaking. I stayed with her. I couldn't leave. When the boy's breathing stopped, she didn't cry. She just whispered, "He's with the Emperor now." I wanted to tell her the truth, that the Emperor has no arms left to hold the dead, but I couldn't. Instead, I took the aquila from my armor and placed it in her hand. "Then he'll find him easier," I said. She looked at me for a long time, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years: forgiveness. Not for the Imperium, for me, for all of us, for being alive in a universe that doesn't deserve it. When we reached the next port, she disembarked with the others. I never saw her again, but the sound of her song still follows me, echoing in the hum of engines and the silence between stars. It reminds me that even in this endless machine, even after everything, there are still voices that refuse to stop singing. And maybe that's what family truly is, not the people we keep, but the moments that keep us, the songs that refuse to die. I've lived through so many wars that I no longer remember the names of the worlds I fought for. They blur together, a constellation of smoke and ruin. Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am, what year it is, which uniform I wear, but the faces never fade. The faces always stay. There's a kind of mercy in that. Memory hurts, but it also reminds me that I was once human, that I once belonged to something other than orders and machinery. We eventually reached Terra, not the throne world itself, but one of its orbiting bastions. A world of pilgrims and penitents, drawn by faith like insects to light. It was the first time I'd seen the cradle of humanity, and all I felt was distance. This was the heart of the Imperium, the place that claims to keep the galaxy alive, yet the air smelled of incense and rot. Millions of souls crawling over each other for a glimpse of salvation. I walked through those cathedrals of stone, watched men and women kneel until their knees bled, whispering prayers to a God who no longer answers. I wanted to scream, to tell them that the Emperor isn't listening, that he's nothing but a corpse on a throne, sustained by the dreams of the dying. But I didn't, because their belief was all they had left, and I envied them for it. I met a priest there, an old man with eyes clouded by blindness. He sat beside the walkway, offering blessings to anyone who passed. When I stopped, he reached out and touched my face. "You carry grief," he said softly, "but also defiance." I didn't answer. He smiled faintly. "Grief is the shadow of love, the Emperor's light hins through those who refuse to let the shadow win." It was the first time anyone had spoken about love and the Emperor in the same breath, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't wrong. I left that world a few days later. Another assignment, another transport, but something stayed with me. A whisper, a question I couldn't silence. What if love itself is our last act of rebellion? Out there among the cold stars, I began to collect fragments, small tokens, relics of the people I met. A torn photograph from a refugee, a child's toy carved from bone, a ribbon soaked in engine oil. They became my shrine, not to the Emperor, but to humanity. Each piece a reminder that even in a universe built on cruelty, tenderness still finds a way to exist. Sometimes during transit, I'd take them out and lay them before me, the way priests arrange their relics before a sermon. I'd whisper the names of those I remembered: Mara, Leo, Sira, the mother and her son, and countless others whose names I never learned. I'd whisper until the silence felt full again. The soldiers around me thought I was mad. Maybe they were right, but madness in this galaxy might be the only form of clarity left. One night the ship passed near a dying star, the entire hold filled with crimson light. I stood at the viewport and watched it flicker, its final fire swallowing itself. It was beautiful in a way I can't describe, like watching a memory burn. It made me think about how the Imperium clings to its light the same way that star did. Blazing, consuming, refusing to fade even when everything around it turns to shadow. Maybe that's all any of us are doing, burning as slowly as we can before the dark takes us. I've stopped calling myself a soldier. The word doesn't fit anymore. I'm a witness. A chronicler of what the Imperium forgets. I write letters to no one. Stories of families torn apart, of love buried under doctrine, of faith twisted into obedience. I know they'll never be read. The administratum will burn them if they're ever found. But still I write, because writing is remembering, and remembering is resistance. There are nights when I imagine another version of myself, a man who never left the hive, who grew old beside Mara, who taught Leo how to fix machines instead of how to hold a weapon. I picture the three of us sitting on a balcony overlooking the smog, sharing stories of stars we'd never see. I hold onto that image like a relic, a false memory, perhaps, but in a universe where truth is torture, maybe lies can save you. I once thought the Imperium was eternal. Now I think nothing is, not even gods. Everything ends, empires fall, stars die, names fade, but what lingers stubbornly, impossibly, is the echo of love. It hides in the smallest corners of existence, in the way someone reaches out before dying, or hums a song to calm a child, or writes a name into the dirt before the storm erases it. That's what family means here. Not safety, not warmth, just persistence. The refusal to stop caring, even when caring gets you killed. When I die, and I know it won't be long, I hope it's somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can see the stars again. I'll lay out the relics I've gathered, one by one, and whisper the names until they dissolve into the void. And if there's anything after this, anything beyond the war, beyond the Emperor, beyond the endless night, I hope I'll see them there. Mara, Leo, Sira, and all the others I failed to save. Maybe we'll sit beneath a sky that isn't burning. Maybe Leo will laugh again and Mara will sing. Maybe the silence will finally mean peace, not punishment. Or maybe there's nothing. Maybe oblivion is the only mercy the universe allows. Either way, I'll face it with my eyes open. Because after everything, I've learned one truth, one fragile, heretical truth the Imperium could never destroy. That love is the Emperor's greatest enemy. Because it asks us to see each other, to remember each other, to grieve, to hope. And if enough of us remember, if enough of us love in spite of everything, maybe that's how the stars begin again.